ندائي لكل اللبنانيين
I call all the Lebanese people to put Lebanon's interest, its safety, the protection of civil peace, and prevention of economic deterioration over anything else. To all partners in the political life, I say our responsibility today is how to protect Lebanon and prevent any fire from reaching it.
That was Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri there, calling for unity after resigning, giving in to nearly 2 weeks of nationwide protests. They were sparked by a proposed tax on WhatsApp calls, the final straw in a series of deeply unpopular austerity measures. Lebanese citizens are also angry about corruption and crony capitalism. The economy has been struggling, and around a third of the country lives under the poverty line. Well, for more on Lebanon's political turmoil and what the future holds for its economy, I'm joined by Hafed Al Ghwell. He's a senior fellow at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much.
So as we heard there, the Prime Minister announcing his resignation in an attempt to really unify the country. But how do you see that impacting the protests and in turn the economy?
It doesn't seem to have appeased the protesters. The protesters have been calling for a new sort of contract. They are arguing that the government for the last few years has not been able to deliver on multiple demands, including basic services like electricity, water, jobs, and so on. Lebanon suffers from about 20% unemployment. Among the youth, it's 30%. It has received, over the last few years, over 1.5 million Syrian refugees. And it has already about 500,000 Palestinian refugees. That makes it almost about 30% of the population. I mean, imagine 100 million Mexicans are refugees in the United States. And you could imagine the impact that had on public services and the government. Add to that, they have enormous corruption problems. They have debts that are among the highest in the world. I think Lebanon is about number 3 in the world in terms of debts to GDP. Their rankings are plummeting to junk levels. So they are really in the middle of a storm from all sides.
And it's interesting because we're finding with a lot of these protests that we're seeing around the world, there's sort of that straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of a breaking, but there's usually some sort of underlying frustrations that have been building up, and then it sort of reaches that breaking point. How does this turn around then? I mean, if the resignation won't work, what do you think might?
That's the big issue. I mean, even the central bank governor keeps on sort of sounding the alarm. Yesterday, in a couple of interviews, he was speaking about a solution that has to happen in a matter of days. That's a very, very alarming language from a central bank governor. I think the international community, whether it likes it or not, will have to come up with some kind of a package to save Lebanon, equivalent to what, for example, the IMF did and the EU did to Greece a few years back.
So then are we at a crisis point? A lot of people are saying we're now at a different economic crisis in Lebanon. Is that fair?
It is very fair. Dangerous part is, of course, from a geopolitical perspective. Lebanon, as you know, went through horrendous civil war for almost 20 years. It is still very much a fractured country that is, most of its politics and economy is predicated on ethnic and religious sort of power sharing. It has Syria on its borders that is in the middle of chaos. You have also the element of Hezbollah, which have an enormous influence in Lebanon, and how that plays out with the Israelis, for example. And so Lebanon is a tinderbox in a region that is very difficult to manage. And I think so far I haven't seen any responses internationally, but I think somebody needs to take the initiative, because Lebanon at this point cannot even borrow in the international market. Its rankings are junk levels.
So then what is at stake, not just for Lebanon, but for the surrounding countries? I mean, you mentioned the influx of refugees and how much pressure that puts. If Lebanon then also finds itself in crisis, what happens to the region's economy?
It's going to, just tumble down. Syria is already in a very difficult situation. Lebanon, how that then becomes sort of a spread of all kinds of problems, as you know, over the years we've seen in the Middle East. you have one collapse in one country like Afghanistan, but then the offshoots become global. And if Lebanon goes to that level, then with the combination of Syria, then it's going to be a very, very dangerous consequence.
And just quickly, we know that the Prime Minister had tried to present proposals to wipe out Lebanon's budget deficit next year, reduce wasteful spending. The IMF applauded this. Other critics say, look, it's just not realistic. What do you think is needed at this point going forward? Because they mentioned solutions needed in days. Where do you start?
I think really you need an international will around, for example, the IMF to try to sort of throw a safety line to Lebanon and sort of put a very strong demands on Lebanon to deliver on reforms in a very quick way. Because if it's obvious, I mean, the protesters respond to what Mr. Hariri outlined a few days ago as an initiative, is that, you've been in office for all these years, why haven't you done anything? There was also all kinds of scandals that surrounded Mr. Hariri only a month ago, where he was throwing all kinds of millions of dollars at a South African model. Meanwhile, a big chunk of his employees in one of his family businesses have not been paid. Credibility is the basis of politics and economics. When a government loses its credibility and the trust of its population, somebody from the outside has to step in. The problem is, as you know, the Prime Minister has to be a Sunni Muslim. And so far, it's very unclear who can replace Mr. Hariri. That's something. Lebanon stayed at one point for, I think it broke the record for a country without a cabinet, without a government. They stayed for a long time. That would be a very dangerous thing now in the middle of this crisis.
Well, we'll certainly be watching as it all unfolds. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Always
much.
good to see you. Hafed Al Ghwell there, Senior Fellow at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University.